Okay, hello everyone. This is the Week 2 lecture for Early American Literature, and today we are continuing our survey of early encounters with Native Americans by Europeans, this early colonial literature, and thinking in particular this week about how Native Americans are depicted and characterized, described in the different texts, whether it's an excerpt from a book that feels a bit like a travelogue. Here I'm thinking of The World Encompassed by Sir Francis Drake, or whether it's actually just poetry that offers a picture of how Native Americans felt when they encountered these Europeans. Some of them, of course, felt quite antagonistic, and because of that antagonism, predicted or imagined that war was coming or that war was inevitable. But the thing that I want us to remember, and I mentioned this last week, so much of what I want you to read and so much of what I am asking you to read, even though it depicts and offers a picture of Native Americans, it's so often mediated through and by these white European writers, almost always, almost exclusively male writers. We'll come to a couple of examples of female writers who also offer a picture of these interactions with Native Americans, but that's, again, important to remember because that means far too often we are perhaps seeing Native Americans, whether the intentions are benevolent or malevolent, through this white settler colonialist perspective. And for today, I think I want to start with the longest of all the texts I asked you to read, The World Encompassed by Sir Francis Drake, And I wanted to say a quick something about the authorship of this text, because even that, the by Sir Francis Drake is a bit misleading, because you may have noticed that Drake is a character in this story, but he was not actually the author, even though he was credited as the author. The actual author was Francis Fletcher. So here, I mentioned again just a moment ago how there are these layers of mediation. Well, this just adds another layer of mediation. This is a text purportedly by Sir Francis Drake, featuring Sir Francis Drake, but he wasn't actually the author of this text. So that's just something else to keep in mind. It perhaps reveals more than anything else how, especially with literature, especially with the written word, there are so many layers of mediation that we often don't take into account because we're not taught to take it into account. We assume that what's on the page is a reflection of whomever the author is, and too often that author is either nominal in the case of The World Encompassed by Sir Francis Drake, which is to say he's the author, but he's the author in name only. He isn't actually the author. And even today we have these sorts of situations. This happens quite often with politicians and political figures where the books they write, they're not actually the authors. There are often ghost writers that either write the book in its entirety or they help the political figure in question craft and frame the language they use in the book. So again, it's just something to keep in mind that even today this happens quite often with ghostwriters, for example. But a great place to start is here at the beginning, where we receive this initial depiction of Native Americans as they approach. And I think it's worth asking, how are they fashioning themselves? How does the text want us to think about them, etc.? So I'll begin here on page 48, and I'll just read directly from the text. In their coming forwards, they cried continually after a singing manner with a lusty courage. And as they drew nearer and nearer towards us, so did they more and more strive to behave themselves with a certain comeliness and gravity in all their actions, In the forefront came a man of a large body and goodly aspect, bearing the scepter or royal mace made of a certain kind of black wood and in length about 1.5 yards before the king. So here, that short paragraph in particular that begins with, "In their coming forwards they cried continually after a singing manner," we're certainly perhaps getting this picture of the Native American as an unbridled savage. We talked about this last time, some of the mischaracterizations, some of the oversimplified ways these white European settlers depict Native Americans in the literature that we have. And this is certainly not unique to Drake, but it is unique for us to this point in the semester, in addition to or coupled with this barbarism. We have this sense that they also want to be hospitable. And this is something that the text returns to multiple times. This idea that they want to be potentially ruled and governed by these European settlers. And I'll return to this at the end, but this is certainly potentially a bit of propaganda designed to rally support for this colonialist project. Again, I'll just read, "And as they drew nearer and nearer towards us, so did they more and more strive to behave themselves." Again, I think this is so important, this sense that, yes, they're savages, but they are savages that want to be governed by us. They're savages who want us to inflict or impart our religion, our customs, our notions of what civilization looks like on them. And again, this is deeply troubling, especially reading it in the 21st century, but that's certainly part of what the text communicates, it seems, in moments like this. And I think we see this image once again communicated on the very next page at the top on 49. This is a description of this train of people, and I'll read, it's at the very top of page 49. "This one thing was observed to be general amongst them all, that every one had his face painted, some with white, some black, and some with other colors, every man also bringing in his hand one thing or other for a gift or present." So once again, the way their faces and their bodies are adorned, it's meant to feel very tribalistic. It's meant to feel perhaps even a bit animalistic, but they come bearing gifts. They come bearing these signifiers of hospitality. So once again, communicating this image of the Native American as this heathen, this simplistic figure who is perhaps more than anything inviting these Europeans to rule and govern them. And we also see on page 50, and we could imagine that the two early moments that I just identified function as a bit of foreshadowing for what ultimately happens on page 50, where the natives relinquish their power. And I would encourage you to pause for a moment and think about, well, what does this ultimately mean? What does this suggest? Again, is this really just the culmination of some of that foreshadowing that I mentioned before? But I'll read from the text and then say one or two things about it. This is that first full paragraph on page 50. "After that they had satisfied, or rather tired themselves in this manner, they made signs to our general to have him sit down, unto whom both the king and divers others made several orations, or rather, indeed, if we had understood them, supplications, that he would take the providence and kingdom into his hand, and become their king and patron, making signs that they would resign unto him their right and title in the whole land, and become his vassals in themselves and their posterities, which that they might, make us indeed believe that it was their true meaning and intent, the king himself, with all the rest, with one consent and with great reverence, joyfully singing a song, set the crown upon his head, enriched his neck with all their chains, and offered unto him many other things, honoring him by the name of Hoyo, adding thereunto, as it might seem, a song and dance of triumph, because they were not only visited of their gods, for so they still judged us to be, but the great and chief God was now become their God, their king and patron, and themselves were become the only happy and blessed people in the world. These things being so freely offered, our general thought not meet to reject or refuse the same, both for that he would not give them any cause of mistrust or disliking of him, that being the only place wherein, at this present, we were of necessity enforced to seek relief of many things, and chiefly for that he knew not to what good end God had brought this to pass, or what honor and profit it might bring to our country in time to come. So let's unpack this just for a minute. We're told here at the top of page 50 that these natives just, it seems, instinctually relinquished control, perhaps because they thought or understood these white colonial figures as either gods or representatives of God. And that creates or produces, for us as readers, this rather simplistic image or picture of who these Native Americans were. There's no scrutiny here. There's no incredulity, which is to say, under no circumstances do they do what perhaps any of us would do. They just assume these new arrivals are something they're clearly not. And all of that has a way of positioning these white European colonial figures and these white European colonists as authoritative and right in their efforts to colonize North America. Because it seems as if, and I think this is important, this is such a crucial point to make, as this text suggests, they did not take something. Something was given to them. And just thinking about the subtleties of that distinction. When you take something, you may do so, whether you knew it at the time or not, incorrectly. But if something's given to you, if consent is given, then have you really done anything wrong? And I think that's part of what's happening here. That's part of how this text crafts this picture of the colonizing of North America as not a taking, but as a giving. Consent was given. And this is something that resonates in popular imagination so much in a show like Mad Men. The creators actually satire this idea. In one of the early episodes of season 1, one of the characters, when speaking about the uses of, I believe, a Native American mascot or Native American iconography on a cigarette label, says something to the effect, well, my God, they gave this land to us. So you can actually see or trace, and if you're not familiar with Mad Men, my apologies, but this idea, this notion that we did not take from them, but what we received was given to us, consent was given, consent was acknowledged, you're actually seeing that work here. And it's the kind of work that isn't new. But you can also see how Christianity becomes an integral part of this whole ideological project. Because in the passages that I read, and I'll read it again, and chiefly, for that he knew not to what good end God had brought this to pass. And let's not confuse ourselves or make this more complicated than we need to. The reference Fletcher makes here is, of course, to the God of Christianity. He makes an overt reference to Christianity in this sense, or this notion that what's happening, not only was consent given by Native Americans or by the Native Americans for everything that came to pass, but even the idea that this whole enterprise was potentially sanctioned by and endorsed by God. That's so important. And I'll come back to that later in the semester when we read Mary Rawlinson, because I think you see that same sort of idea at play. This is God's divine will, and who would disagree with or who would challenge God's authority. And for time purposes, I won't say anything particular about Drake and how I won't read anything from the text regarding Drake, but I would just encourage you to notice how heroic Fletcher describes him. He is very much, and I think there's even this moment near the end when we are told, or it's suggested, that he is this de facto father figure, both literally, but perhaps more importantly, symbolically, the symbolic father figure for these Native Americans, for these unintelligent, barbaric natives. And just that fashioning of Drake in that way is quite important and quite interesting. And it works to, and it helps to develop this idea, this notion, this ideological reading of Native Americans as just these infantile figures who need to be governed. I'll read, for example, on page 51, near the end. And this is the final paragraph. They are a people of a tractable, free, and loving nature, without guile or treachery. Their bows and arrows, their only weapons, and almost all their wealth, they use very skillfully, but yet not to do any great harm with them, being by reason of their weakness more fit for children than for men, sending the arrows neither far off nor with any great force, and yet are the men commonly so strong of body that which 2 or 3 of our men could hardly bear, one of them would take upon his back, and without grudging carry it easily away, uphill and downhill, an English mile together. They are also exceedingly swift in running, and of long countenance. The use whereof is so familiar with them, that they seldom go, but for the most part run. One thing we observed in them with admiration, that if at any time they changed to see a fish so near the shore that they might reach the place without swimming, they would never, or very seldom, miss to take it. So we'll address this a little near the end of the semester, the way black slaves were written about and spoken about during the antebellum period, and even long after the American Civil War. But it is striking the similarities between the way Native Americans are described in texts like this and the way black slaves are described in the 17th, 18th, and well into the 19th century. This emphasis on physicality, but this equal emphasis on a kind of intellectual inferiority. Again, they're like these big children. And while this is certainly grotesque and horrifying and wrong, it certainly does give us a striking picture of how the other is often thought about and written about in these sorts of either first encounter narratives, but also in literature, in particular during the mid-19th century, that advocated strongly for the continuation of the institution of slavery in the United States. So I think I'll move on from The World Encompassed by Sir Francis Drake And for perhaps a text that offers something of a contrast, let's say a quick something about Powhatan's Discourse of Peace and War. Now, again, it's important to acknowledge that this text also has a white European figure as the author, as this source of mediation, John Smith, but what we're given here is something of a slightly different characterization and representation of Native Americans. Look, for example, on page 53. This is around the middle of the page. Think you I am so simple? Not to know it is better to eat good meat, lie well, and sleep quietly with my women and children, laugh and be merry with you, have copper hatchets, or what I want being your friend, then be forced to fly from all to lie cold in the woods, feed upon acorns, roots, and such trash, and be so hunted by you that I can neither rest, eat, nor sleep, but my tired men must watch, and if a twig but break, every one crieth, there cometh Captain Smith. Then must I fly, I know not whither, and thus with miserable fear end my miserable life, leaving my pleasures to such youths as you, which through your rash unadvisedness may quickly as miserable end. For want of that, you never know where to find. Let this therefore assure you of our loves, and every year our friendly trade shall furnish you with corn, and now also, if you would come in friendly manner to see us, and not thus with your guns and swords as to invade your foes. So I think maybe the best place to start when thinking about what I just read is, well, what is someone like John Smith attempting to communicate here? Well, we could imagine that he's putting into the mouth of the Native American, capital T, capital N, capital A, this acknowledgement that if white European settlers don't change their behavior, war is perhaps inevitable. And it also gives us this sense that that war would be inhumane, it would be unfair. And how is that something that a God-loving and God-fearing European Christian could ever possibly endorse? But it also gives us this sense that, in particular, in contrast to the world encompassed by Sir Francis Drake, this sense that the Native American is not this simple barbarian. Again, such an unfair and grotesque caricature. But if you think about, in particular, what I just read, there's a kind of calculation happening here. There's a sense that the Native Americans saw and understood potentially what would happen, or what it seemed as if might happen if things continued as they were. But also, and I think more importantly, this sense that the Native American is not this simpleton who needs to be governed by someone, in particular, white Europeans. The Native American, according to John Smith in this short excerpt, clearly understands the benefits of peace, understands the differences, for example, between sleeping and lying in a comfortable place with good food, good people, loved ones, and whatever the opposite or antithesis of that might be. So this in particular, as a response, the Powhatan's Discourse on Peace and War, certainly has the effect of revealing to us that not all European settlers, not all of the Europeans who wrote about those initial encounters with Native Americans had this conquering and colonizing ideology, whether they were aware of it or not, as a driving force. That perhaps instead there might be these figures who were attempting to do something different, even if some problems still exist when we think about what peace and friendliness ultimately looks like, and in particular when we think about what representation ultimately looks like, when thinking about, again, how so much of this is mediated by these white European figures. And I think as a way of closing, and you'll notice that for this week I've included some additional materials about the war speech or the war song as a genre. It's extremely popular. Everything from, I believe I offered a soliloquy from Shakespeare's Henry V, to even if you think about a contemporary science fiction action film like Independence Day. If you've seen Independence Day, you know there's a moment when, I don't know if it's Bill Pullman or Bill Paxton, I always confuse them, but he offers a rousing speech meant to rally the troops. Again, it's this war speech or this war song. It fits quite comfortably within that genre. And we're seeing something similar here with the Cherokee war song and the Lenape war song. And I think just because of time constraints, or just for time constraints, or in acknowledgement of time constraints, I think I'll just focus on one of the two. And I think I want to say a quick something about the Lenape war song. And again, I think it's important to acknowledge, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, but I'll reiterate it because I think so much of what this poem does is invert the tone of so many of the sorts of songs and poems that fit within this war song, war poem genre, because all of them, and again, I referenced Independence Day, the overarching rhetorical goal is to rally or rouse the troops. It's really designed to convince someone that dying in a noble war, and again, I would place air quotes around a word like noble, but dying in a noble war is one of the best things someone could do, and you should do it willingly, and you should do it dispassionately. So I'll actually just read this entire poem because it is quite short. It begins on page 57. "Oh, poor me, who am going out to fight the enemy, and know not whether I shall return again to enjoy the embraces of my children and my wife. O poor creature, whose life is not in his own hands, who has no power over his own body, but tries to do his duty for the welfare of his nation. O thou great spirit above, take pity on my children and on my wife. Prevent their mourning on my account. Grant that I may be successful in this attempt, that I may slay my enemy and bring home the trophies of war to my dear family and friends, that we may rejoice together. Oh, take pity on me. Give me strength and courage to meet my enemy. Suffer me to return again to my children, to my wife, and to my relations. Take pity on me and preserve my life, and I will make to thee a sacrifice." So, again, I think this poem is in contrast to so much of what we see from this genre. This is not the only example of a poem that fits within this war poem, war song genre that actually laments the activities and endeavors of war itself, but it is a striking example of a counter-narrative for a few different reasons. Notice, for example, in lines 7 through 10, how this speaker acknowledges their powerlessness. Who has no power over his own body, but tries to do his duty for the welfare of his nation. And I think you could argue that from many of my accounts, for example, or many of the accounts that military officers have told me, there is this sense of powerlessness. And while they may not feel it at first, while they may not feel it initially, from what almost all of them have told me, there's always a moment when you, as the soldier, feel utterly powerless. But also just this sense that the speaker wants pity as well. Take pity on me. And I think what's interesting about this is how strength is communicated not by or through a kind of rejection, dismissal, or suppression of those sorts of feelings, those very human feelings, but through a kind of acknowledgement of them. There's really a kind of power, it seems, in just acknowledging those feelings. But more than anything, and this is the last thing I'll say, what I find interesting about this poem, especially if we want to imagine and envision that, as we should, the speaker is a Native American. This is the kind of text that potentially a Native American tribe or community produced. This gives us just a sense of the depth of humanity. And while it may seem self-evident to say that, well, of course, how could they be anything but human? So much of the literature about Native Americans, especially these first encounter narratives, don't acknowledge that. Once again, think back to what I discussed earlier in this lecture, The World Encompassed by Sir Francis Drake. That is a text in many ways that does not present Native Americans as having the same kind of depth and the same kind of humanity that we see in the Lenape war song. Okay, I think that's where I want to stop. I hope everyone has a great day and a great week. Again, this is Colin Cox for Early American Literature, English 2110. Once again, have a good day, and I will talk to you next week.